Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass it off to our critic for foreign affairs, Heather McPherson, who is also joined by our deputy critic for immigration, Blake Desjarlais, and Frishta Baston, a member of the Afghan Youth Engagement and Development Initiative. After they speak, we'll take questions from the media. To ask a question, please use the raised hand function, or you can send me a message in the chat. Just to note that this is now being recorded. And if you would like a copy of the recording, you can send me an email and I will pass that along to you. Okay, over to you, Heather.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us today on this very sad anniversary. You know, we are speaking today because today is the 6-month anniversary of the day that Kabul fell. And I wanted to make sure that we raised this important issue because there are a lot of things that are going on around the world right now. And I think it's vital that as parliamentarians that we continue to do what we can to raise awareness around issues that are happening in Afghanistan, that Afghanistan does not get forgotten. You know, it's been 6 months since Kabul has fallen. And I think when we consider just how much Canada has worked in Afghanistan, the important role that Canada has played in Afghanistan to empower women and girls, to protect democracy, to protect human rights, to ensure the principles of good governance are secured, to know the work that we have put into Afghanistan and how devastating it is to see these gains be lost, to see the diminishment of those things by the Taliban is devastating to me. Today, I want to talk a little bit about some of the humanitarian crisis that is facing Afghanistan right now. I want to raise issues that are of vital importance to myself, to my colleagues within the New Democratic Party, but also to the Afghan Canadian community, and to the community at large. You know, right now, we are looking at a situation where there are 23 million Afghans that are at desperate risk of starvation this winter. We have heard from the United Nations Development Program that 97% of Afghans' population will or has plunged into poverty by the middle of 2022, that there is an incredible food crisis for children under 5. Up to 1 million children under 5 could die by the end of the year due to this food crisis and due to the lack of water and sanitation services. You know, these facts are coming to us from organizations like UNICEF. We know that the United Nations has asked for more funding from the international community, has asked the international community to step up, and that hasn't happened. So what we're seeing in Afghanistan is many things coming together that are making it almost impossible for Afghans to be able to survive and thrive as we go forward. Now, while the Taliban, of course, bears responsibility for much of the crisis that is happening in Afghanistan, Canada has failed to help. Canada's failed to do our part, our role in terms of helping Afghan refugees come to Canada, helping Afghan refugees settle in our country. That was part of the petition that I was able to table today on behalf of many, many Canadians, many Afghan Canadians, but also our international development is a challenge. So right now, we have Canadian terror legislation that's in place. And Canadian organizations have been flagging for months now that the language in the criminal code, particularly section 83.03 concerning provisions of property or financial or other services to a terrorist group, have made it impossible for Canadian organizations to do what they can for Afghans on the ground. There needs to be more done by the federal government to actually reduce the impacts of the counterterrorism legislation. We've seen this done in other countries. The United States, the United Kingdom have all put exemptions in place so that so that their organizations can work on the ground. But our government has been extremely slow on this. They've moved extremely slow, and we have not been able to get the support to the Afghan population that we need to do. So I'm going to focus a lot on that humanitarian crisis. I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Blake Desjarlais, who will talk a little bit about the immigration piece. Because when I talk about the challenges that Afghanistan is facing, it is multi-pronged, but the two big prongs that we're looking at today are the humanitarian crisis that is ongoing and that is dire and requires an urgent response, and there is the immigration crisis. So as our deputy critic for immigration, Blake, can I pass it to you for you to raise those important issues around immigration?
Thank you very much, Heather. And first, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Treaty 6 territory and lands of the Dene, Cree, and Métis people. But I also want to thank everyone who's joined us today, and especially my colleague, Heather McPherson, MP for Edmonton Strathcona, for her steadfast work and commitment to making sure we help Afghan folks who are fleeing violence from the Taliban. In the last 6 months, there's been only 7,550 Afghan refugees that have been settled in Canada out of a promised 40,000. So this is simply unacceptable. It's evidence of a system that's truly broken, and IRCC has been broken for some time, but we haven't seen the kinds of commitments that are needed to make sure we address the humanitarian crisis and the folks who are fleeing from truly hostile situation. Canada should work to accelerate the pace of resettlement to meet the urgency of the situation, as well as to ensure that those who are resettled in Canada have the access to the critical services that they need, including health and psychosocial support. And Canada should work to establish a safe evacuation route for those most at risk, including women activists, LGBTIQ plus folks, members of the ethnic and religious minority groups, journalists, disability rights advocates, and human rights defenders, and their families. Canada must enact emergency immigration measures to issue temporary resident permits to internally displaced persons in Afghanistan who currently don't qualify under any existing streams. There should be no bureaucratic red tape impeding Afghans as they look for ways to get to safety. Having authorizations to travel to Canada readily on hand would vastly support Afghans in their difficult journeys to fleeing the country. Canada must increase flexibility by reducing the documentation burden for the TRP process and Afghan applicants in other streams. This flexibility should provide for waived documentation requirements that can be addressed once the applicant is safe in Canada. This can be done. The government must develop a plan to quickly relocate those vulnerable individuals to Canada, replicating the commitment and urgency Canada demonstrated when we resettled thousands of Syrian refugees in just 2015. Further, a plan should remove barriers produced by allocation limits imposed on the sponsorship agreement holders, something that we can truly do and something that the minister can do quickly. And finally, Canada must waive the refugee status determination card requirement to allow for prompter sponsorship and reduce potential administrative roadblocks like what was done for the Syrian refugees back in 2015. Again, we have some of these solutions in our toolbox. We know what works. A whole of government approach is needed to bring Afghans to safety. And New Democrats like Heather McPherson and I are committed to this. But in order to highlight this true urgency and what's needed as it is a true humanitarian crisis, I'd like to now introduce a representative from the Afghan Youth Engagement and Develop Initiative, Frishta Baston, a remarkable youth group she's representing, who are hoping to build and promote mental, social, and community health of Afghan youth here in Canada. Would you be okay if I shared some time with you, Frishta?
Thank you so much, Blake, and thank you so much, Heather. Salam and hello, everyone. My name is Frishta Baston. I'm a strategist with the Canadian Campaign for Afghan Peace. Thank you, everyone, for being here today to mark the unfortunate occasion of the 6-month anniversary of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and the ongoing humanitarian and refugee crisis. I'm here today to provide the perspective of the Afghan Canadian community. I want to begin by remembering the unnamed brother of the Canadian embassy worker and the 10-year-old Nazifa, the daughter of an Afghan who worked for the Canadian military. These individuals were presumably killed by the Taliban while their applications were delayed due to paperwork. You must know that the people of Afghanistan have been living under conflict and instability for over 3 decades. Every Afghan I know has lost a family member or relative to conflict. Every Afghan has suffered some kind of a loss in the last decade because of this war. Those who don't have any physical scars have severe psychological ones, ones that will remain for generations to come. As a Hazara woman, every day I fear for my family's lives. They've been historically and presently targeted by the Taliban simply for being Hazara. We've heard stories of family members in Afghanistan who work for the government and either have not received a paycheck or a reduced paycheck in several months. We have heard of the Afghan Canadian family member who died from a roadside bomb near the Kabul airport in the early days of the crisis as he was coming home from work. He leaves behind 4 children under the age of 10. We've heard of families having to make the decisions to either sell their kids or their kidneys to provide for their families. I can tell you about the countless young people and families who reached out to Ivy asking for help with applying for asylum, detailing their life stories and the risks they face, many wondering why there has been no response from the government. The Afghan community in Canada had high expectations of the Canadian government. There were made lots of promises, and there were made lots of grand promises. We will accept 40,000 refugees. We will help evacuate those at heightened risk. We will honor our commitment to Afghans who helped their troops during their combat mission. We will do this all in a timely manner. But over time, we only heard excuses and delays. To the point where today, at the 6-month mark, Canada has only settled a meager 7,550 refugees, not even 20% of their commitment. Throughout the last several months, Afghan Canadians were not only frantically trying to get a hold of their family members, we also had to wade through the bureaucratic terrain of Canada's resettlement programs for Afghans. We had to take matters into our own hands. We have felt abandoned and unheard by the government. We feel completely alone. Although we acknowledge the efforts so far, it is not enough. Today, our parliamentary petition for Afghanistan was tabled in the House by Heather McPherson, and we are calling on Canada to resettle at least 95,000 Afghans and to do it quickly, to remove any red tape, including excessive documentation requirements for applying, and to include Afghan Canadians in the decision-making process and to consult us. We are the ones actively doing the work, yet we are being excluded from these spaces. We're calling on the leaders of our country who are supposed to represent us and to uphold our commitment into the international community to protect the most vulnerable and fulfill the commitment we made to Afghans. For as long as one Afghan lives, so does Afghanistan. I send my peace and solidarity with all the Afghans in Canada and worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We will now take questions from members of the media. As a reminder, to ask a question, please use the raised hand function. You'll get 1 question and 1 follow-up. Okay, the first question goes to Marie Wolfe at the Canadian Press. And sorry, Marie, I just have to unmute you. All right, go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I wondered whether you were concerned that places on the Humanitarian program, which is the special program for vulnerable groups, which you mentioned, Blake, apparently they're full up. I mean, I think it's the various groups that are the conduit for this program say that they haven't got any more spaces. Do you think that should be expanded?
Thanks so much for that question, Marie. And I do believe, yes, of course, that should be expanded. And IRCC has traditionally been underfunded, which I do believe has created some of the conditions that we're seeing across the board for some of the existing programs. There's not only a huge backlog of existing applications, but of course, the programs that are currently in place are far oversubscribed. And we do need to see action by the minister to make sure we can address some of the resourcing issues with IRCC, to make sure issues like the ones you're presenting for program deficits are actually met, because we're not going to be able to take in folks, especially those fleeing emergency situations, and be able to host them in a good way if these programs aren't satisfactory. But thanks so much for that question.
Can I just move on to another topic, which Blake and Heather, I'd be very interested to know your views on the invoking the Emergency Act. I mean, it's never been used before, and I know that the NDP position is that they support it. But I wondered if you had any reservations, or if you felt that there should be limits on the powers invoked by this act.
Blake, do you want to take a stab, and I'll jump in after?
Sure. I think certainly, you know, I think New Democrats, well, just Canadians across the country are concerned, of course, with an act it's unprecedented right now, the use of the Emergencies Act. And of course, although New Democrats believe this is a required, something that's required right now to face the urgent emergency facing Canadians, and in our own home province in particular, we've seen armed militia just south of our border. These are serious issues, and it's an emergency indeed. But I do believe that Canadians rightfully should question the limits of authority of a government that would be imposing these kinds of acts. And New Democrats stand committed to making sure that we uphold, we have a transparency with the government, but also hold them to account on the use of these authorities. And we don't agree, for example, with use of the military, for example, or any overreach that could harm Canadians' ability to understand or limit their restrictions. So I do think that we do, of course, support that, you know that, but there are reasonable limits that we have to take and that the government should be held accountable for. But I thank you for the question, Heather.
And Marie, I just would follow up as well that, you know, the reason we're in this situation is because not enough has been done in the first 18, 19 days of this crisis. Blake's perfectly right to point out that in Coutts, Alberta, you know, we have a blockade that they have now found guns, ammunition, body armor. We have an armed militia. This is very, very dangerous, but we didn't have to get to this place. There was many things that could have been done that haven't been done. You know, things that we've brought forward at committee in terms of bringing in the ambassador. I've asked for the U.S. ambassador to come and answer questions at the Foreign Affairs Committee. My colleague Alistair McGregor has brought forward motions of public safety. You know, the leader, Jagmeet Singh, has brought forward the emergency debate for us to talk about this in the House. There are things that the government needed to do, and we are in the situation we are in right now because they did not take those steps. They did not do that work that needed to get done.
Thank you, Marie. The next question will go to Ahmed El-Bayoumi from News Beyond. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Hi there, can you hear me? Thanks for taking my question. Hope you're all doing well. I want to ask about the resignation of Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly. Do you have any reaction to that? I know you spoke about what had to be done over the last 19 days. Do you think that this was a right decision on his side?
I can jump into that one, Blake, and then pass it over to you. I mean, obviously, one of the things that we are really hoping to talk to folks today about is the fact that it is the 6-month anniversary since the fall of Kabul, and the you know, the disastrous things that are happening in Afghanistan right now and the urgent need for the government to act. I do understand, though, that this is a very, very busy week in Ottawa and that there is an awful lot going on. So in terms of the police chief stepping down, that's obviously not a conversation that federal politicians, you know, there is a difference between, or a distance between police and the federal government. I will say that I'm deeply concerned about the differences that we have seen in terms of policing in this country. I'm concerned about the fact that we have seen the police embrace and not deal with the blockades and the convoys the same way that we have seen them many times deal with environmental, deal with Indigenous, deal with other protesters in this country. So I think that as a country, we need to have a very serious conversation about policing in our country. As a federal politician, I don't have a role in whether or not the chief should step down.
All right, thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, during the election, Mr. Singh spoke a lot about, you know, Canada's missteps in the response to the crisis in Afghanistan. I'm wondering, because right now we are also seeing a potential risk of invasion in Ukraine. What can Canada learn? What lessons can we learn from the crisis in Afghanistan when responding to the potential invasion in Ukraine? And Ms. McPherson, if you can speak a bit about the decision to send, I think it's $7.8 million of lethal weapons to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Emma. That's a great question. You know, there are lessons that we can learn about what's happened in Afghanistan, and that we in fact still need to learn about what is happening in Afghanistan. So first of all, I want to say that, you know, in February of 2021, I wrote to Minister Garneau, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, and urged him to do more to make sure that our Afghan allies, that those people we had worked with in Afghanistan were taken care of, that they were brought to safety. That was months and months before the withdrawal of US and the fall of Kabul. And yet the government did nothing on that. So we are now in a situation where we have a government that is promising massive numbers without any capacity to do that, to bring those people here, to get those people safe. You know, I'm listening to Friska talk about the fact that she is Hazara and she is worried about people in her community that have died, that are missing, that she doesn't know where they are. Like, can you imagine? And so when we look at Ukraine, when we look at the conflict happening in Ukraine, I want every single person to recognize that the trauma and the pain and the horrible situation that Afghans are finding themselves in, and the worry and the horror that Afghan Canadians are having to go through is something that will be happening in Ukraine. If there is an attack, then there needs to be a way for us to help those 1.5 million internally displaced Ukrainians get to safety to Canada. We need to amp up what we can do through the IRCC and what we can do in terms of helping refugees resettle. We need to invest in humanitarian care and humanitarian response, because what is happening on the ground is affecting Ukrainians. Ukrainian men, women, and children are the ones that are going to bear the burden of this, the same way that Afghan men, women, and children are bearing the burden of that conflict. So when we speak in the House of Commons, when we speak in press conferences, it is vital that we remember we are not speaking about arbitrary or theoretical things. We're talking about people's lives. So do I have concerns about what's happening in Ukraine? Do I see parallels? 100%. And I certainly hope that Canada recognizes the need, the responsibility it has to play with regards to Afghanistan, and does not let us end up in another situation in Ukraine where we have people that are suffering that we have failed to help.
Okay, that concludes today's press conference. Thank you to everyone for joining.